Okay, we're going to talk about domains and ranges really quickly. If you've missed this lesson, the domains and the ranges are basically just, domain refers to all the set of possible x values for a function, and the range basically is all the set of possible y values for a function. And we need to know about real numbers. Real numbers are all the numbers that you know about. They're whole numbers, they're rational numbers, they're irrational numbers. They're basically the set of all numbers that you deal with. So when your textbook talks about the set of real numbers, that's what it's talking about, all numbers that you know about. And in domain and range notation, we basically use a little bit of symbolic language. We use a big R to indicate all real numbers. We use this little sort of E kind of sign that means set of, so a set of all real numbers. And we use these squiggly brackets when we're dealing with domains and ranges. This is the kind of notation that we use. Now, just to give you an idea of how this all works, if we take a real quick look at Desmos, and we have a linear function that we've graphed here, y is equal to 2x. Basically, when you're talking about the domain, which is all your possible x values, in this particular case, there's no restrictions on what x can be. X can be anything. It can be negative, it can be positive. This line just keeps on going to infinity, up and down. So there's no restrictions on the domain, no restrictions. So domain here, all the x values. So domain, or x values, x is all real numbers, or just real numbers, set of real numbers. There's no restrictions. And in this graph, if you look at the y, this graph continues to go forever up and forever down. So there's no restrictions on the range either. So y is the set of all real numbers. So when there's no restrictions, you just write it as, domain, the x values, all possible real numbers. Y values is the range, all possible real numbers. There's no restrictions. But sometimes there can be restrictions on these values. So for example, a graph like this has some restrictions on it, because it only goes from just before 1 on the x-axis to 7 on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, sorry, and then on the y-axis it goes from just above 1 basically to about, 3 point something. So this has a specific restriction. And when it has a restriction, we basically say here that the domain, because it's restricted between here and here, which is just before 1, so we can say its x values, they're going to be greater than 0, but less than 7, because it's going from 0, basically a little bit less than 1 to 7. And we use the squiggly brackets. And then when we do range, squiggly brackets, and the y, basically from here to here is my range. So again, it's just above, it's a little bit above 1. So x is greater than 1. But again, it's restricted to how far up it goes. So it seems to be somewhere just above 3. So we can say is less than 4. We're estimating now, but this is the notation that we use. We use these squiggly brackets, and we indicate how small x is and how big it can be, and there are restrictions around that. When we look at an exponential graph like this one, which is 3x plus 1, and we take a look, and we've got our asymptote obviously at plus 1 because it's gone up 1. Now, what's the restrictions on the domain and range? Well, if you take a look, this graph will go forever to the left and forever to the right along the x-axis. So x is the set of all real numbers. There's no restrictions. But on the range, we have a restriction because it will not actually get to y is 1. It can't get to that. It gets closer and closer and closer to that y is 1, but it won't get to it. And then it will go and be whatever you want it to be. So, and it can't be any negative values. So we have a restriction on the range, and this is how we write it. We use our squiggly brackets, and we say, well, y has got to be greater than 1 at all times. Y can never be 1 or less than 1. and that's the restriction. And that's what we mean by domain and range. We have to get used to writing this type of notation and identifying the restrictions on the domain and ranges.